previous video, we got Node.js downloaded and up and running on your system. Now we're actually going to take a look at how to create a simple HTTP server using Node. So the first thing we're going to build is a simple HTTP server. Now fortunately, Node comes with a lot of great tools for making a server very easily. So the first thing we're going to start off with is some includes. So we're going to include the system library. So we're going to say var sys equals require sys. We're going to use this because we want to output things to the terminal and use some other functions. And another one we're going to want to import is the HTTP library. So we're going to say require HTTP. And so now all of the system library functions will be placed in our sys object, and all of our HTTP methods and variables will be placed in the HTTP variable. So inside the HTTP module, there is a great little function called http.createServer. And this takes a function. This function will be passed a request and a response. And this function will be called every time there's a new request to our HTTP server. So it'll pass us an object that represents the HTTP request as well as the HTTP response object. So what we want our server to do is pretty simple. We're just going to return a little fragment of HTML. First, we need to write out headers. Now this is part of HTTP that's usually abstracted away from us in most development environments. But since create server is a very simple interface, we actually have to set all the headers and write all the data manually instead of just returning it or echoing it out like you might in PHP. So to do that, we're going to say on our result object, there is a write head function. And this takes two arguments. The first is the numeric HTTP status code. So 200 is a successful request. For instance, 404 would mean that this path is not found. The whole list of them is standardized in HTTP 1.1. The second argument is an object that represents the actual headers that we want to send. So the key will be the header name, and the value will be the value for the header. So we do want to set a content type, and our content type will be text/HTML. So now we've sent out our headers, and we can actually start sending out our body. So this is pretty easy. We'll just do a result.end. And what this does is actually two things. If you pass an argument, it will send that data to the client. And then after it sends that data, it'll actually close the HTTP connection, saying that this request response cycle is complete. So we always need to remember to call end, otherwise the connection will be hanging open. So what we're going to do is just say h1 hello world, and we'll close our h1. So now we've sent our response to the client, and we actually need to start our server running. So the HTTP create server function will return our actual server object, but we haven't told it where to host the actual application. So calling .listen on our HTTP server, we can pass it a port number as well as a host to bind to. So in our case, we're just going to do the local host 127.0.0.1. Now normally HTTP servers run on port 80. So when you type something into a browser like google.com, by default it's doing the HTTP request over port 80. But in our case, we're going to switch to a higher port number because usually port 80 is being taken by Apache or another server. So in development, we use a higher number, and I just chose 3000. So now that we're actually listening for connections, this actually happens asynchronously. So code after our listen call will still be executed. So let's just type out a simple courtesy message saying sys.puts, like we saw before, and we'll say server running at http://127.0.0.1:3000. So we're going to save that out and go to our command prompt. And we'll see that we have our http.js file here. So we're just going to call node http.js. And we see our message saying that we're running on port 3000. So let's just copy this and flip over to our web browser and type it in. And we see hello world is returned. And if we look at the source, we can see that it was just a little fragment of HTML, but fortunately the browser can understand it, and we get an H1 type styling on it. So in this example, we just used the end method to print out our string, but if we had multiple pieces of content that we wanted to return, we could actually use the result.write method. So we'll do result.write, and we'll put our hello world in our write call right here. And then down here we'll do h2, and then we'll say this is the end. Now whenever we change our code, we do need to restart our server. So we're going to flip over back to our terminal, and remember that we have to hit Control-C to stop our code, and then we'll just run it once again. And let's see how it goes now. So we're just going to refresh, and now we can see that we get hello world, and then the second chunk, this is the end. Now I told you it's really important to use the end call when you're done with your request. If we just did .write and actually didn't have an end call, let's see what that would do. So we'll hit Control-C to stop our code and reload. And we will flip back to our browser and refresh. Now you'll see that our indicator here is hanging. That's because the server hasn't said it is complete, so the browser thinks that more information might be coming a little bit later. Now we're actually going to use that to our advantage a little bit later to do some more complex file transfers. But in the end, you always have to use the end call. So we're just going to say end. And go ahead and kill this. And you see, as soon as we killed our server, that it says it was not available. That's because it spent all its time trying to get the information, and then the server just dropped off on the other side. So let's start our server once again, refresh, and we'll see it's all right. Now, it doesn't matter what URL we go to. So if we go to /foo/bar, we always get the same piece of data back. So to make this interesting, we need to actually read our information from our URL and present the content back accordingly. We'll be taking a look at that when we build our first web service. And now we've seen how to create a simple HTTP server using Node. In the next video, we'll create a web service that actually does something.